just give me a wave. So what I'm presenting today are some preliminary results from the research I've been doing. And I call it preliminary because these results haven't yet been published. So they will go through a peer review process. They'll be assessed by experts internationally, and they may change slightly, but we're confident that they won't change too much. But just to let you know, that's why they're preliminary. So what I'll do is just go over the aims of my fellowship, and I'll talk a bit about the two study populations I'll be using, the autoimmune study and the MS Sunshine study. I'll give you some results, and then I'll talk about future research plans, and also another study we have going on at the moment with an honours student. So the main aim of my fellowship is to look at the relationship between diet and the risk of a first clinical diagnosis of central nervous system demyelination. I'll call that SCD from now on. So this is a common precursor to MS, but these people haven't yet progressed to MS. And that's an important distinction when we're looking at risk factors, because we know that once people are diagnosed with MS, they're quite likely to change their diet and change other lifestyle characteristics. So once people start changing their diet, we can't look then at the diet as a risk factor. So we have to look right at the start. So what we have are two studies where they recruited people who have had an SCD, and we've looked at what they were eating in the year before. And that's the only real way we can look at risk factors. So I have four specific objectives. One is dietary patterns, well, I'll explain that shortly. Fish and meat consumption and antioxidant intake. So the main study I'm using is an Australian study called the autoimmune study, and it was conducted in 4 regions of Australia. They recruited nearly 300 participants with an SCD and over 500 control participants, so people who didn't have an SCD. And that way we can compare the diet between those who did develop an SCD and those who didn't. And they collected a food frequency questionnaire, which means they asked people what they were eating over the previous year. Now, I will say that this study wasn't designed specifically to measure diet or look at diet. It was designed to look at vitamin D status, region, occupation, and other risk factors. And that's why you can see it's been around 10 years before we've actually looked at the diet questionnaire, because they didn't have any nutritionists on the team. So it's great that I've been gifted the data to actually have the opportunity to look at diet and SCD. And the second study I'm using is the MS Sunshine study. Now this study is taking place in California, and it's a sister study to the autoimmune study. So it was developed afterwards, and it uses a lot of the same methods. And the reason it's really interesting is because this is a totally different population of people. In fact, it's multi-ethnic, whereas the autoimmune study is primarily Caucasian. And the beauty of having 2 different studies that are very similar is that we can repeat the analysis in both studies, and it gives us much stronger evidence about whether an effect is a true effect. So at the moment, what I'll present today are results primarily from the autoimmune study, but I do have one set of results from the MS Sunshine study, and I'm still waiting on more data from this study before I can give you any more results. So the first objective was around dietary patterns. Now this is quite a hot topic in nutrition research, because we've realised that we've acknowledged that people don't eat foods in isolation, they don't eat nutrients in isolation. So dietary patterns is a statistical way of grouping people into certain dietary patterns. And a common one that we see is a Western pattern. So that would be high in processed foods, low in whole grains, low in fruit and veg, high in other unhealthy foods. And then we might see people with a healthy pattern. So they eat the fruit and veg, they eat the whole grains. Now, dietary patterns have been linked to other health conditions. So a Western pattern has been linked to heart disease and breast cancer. There's one study that I know of that has looked at dietary patterns in MS. That was in Iran, and they found that people with MS had a higher intake of a Western pattern. But this doesn't really tell us about risk, and it certainly doesn't tell us about risk of SCD. So when I analysed data from the study, we found that people fell into three distinct groups. So people followed a Western pattern that was high in takeaway meals, processed meats, spirits, fried fish, potatoes, probably chips, poultry, possibly fried chicken, and it was low in whole grains and fresh fruit. The second pattern was pescatarian. So this was high in grilled and tinned fish, and it had other healthy components like whole grains, fresh fruit and veggies, low in refined grains. And the third pattern we found was vegetarian. So we didn't see people in that category eating any meat or fish. They were eating beans and vegetables. So what we found with this analysis is that the Western and vegetarian patterns did not have any link to SCD. So there was no harm, but there was no benefit. But very interestingly, we found that the pescatarian dietary pattern, the one that included fish, actually reduced the risk of FCD. So each dietary pattern is a spectrum from low to high, and everybody ranks somewhere on that spectrum. So the people at the bottom are not at all following a pescatarian pattern. People at the top are fully following it. And what we found was that people in the top 50%, the top half of that pattern, had nearly 40% lower risk of FCD. And that is a really substantial reduction. We get excited if we see an 8% reduction in this type of analysis. So it was very interesting, and it really seems like there's something going on there. Now, these results are regardless of lots of different characteristics of the participants. So it doesn't matter whether you smoke, whether you have Epstein-Barr virus, what your vitamin D status is, this pattern is still protective. So this pattern, though, it doesn't give us an indication about how much fish people might need to eat to actually have a protective effect. So what I did was I looked at fish consumption itself. Now, I'm interested in fish consumption because we know that oily fish particularly contains vitamin D and omega-3, both of which may relate to SCD or MS. White fish, not so much. There is one study that shows that oily fish lowers the risk of MS. They found that if you eat oily fish at least once a week, that's protective. And the authors thought that this was due to the vitamin D content of oily fish, because we do know that vitamin D or low vitamin D is a risk factor for MS. However, it has been shown already in the Ozamine study that omega-3 intake may lower the risk of SCD. And this was particularly for those omega-3s that you get from fish. So it's not the type that you get from plants. You may hear that foods like flaxseed particularly contain omega-3, but they're not in the active form that we use in our body. So we probably only can convert about 3% of the plant sources of omega-3 to the active form. So it really is something that you need to get from either fish or meat, which I'll discuss shortly as well. So what we found was that people who ate tinned fish, and not too much, just 2 serves a week, that was linked with a 34% lower risk of FCD. So again, a really big risk reduction. Now, the reason I think we find it in tinned fish specifically is because tinned fish is most likely to be oily. So people eat salmon, tuna, sardines, and mackerel from tins. They're all types of oily fish. We did look at grilled fish, and we saw a similar trend, but it's not what we call statistically significant. So it could have been a chance finding. And I do wonder if that's because grilled fish may include both oily and white fish. So we might not see the same kind of reduction. And unfortunately, the questionnaire we had didn't differentiate specifically between white and oily fish. And we found no link between fried fish and risk of SVD. So there was no harm in eating fried fish, but there was no benefit. And a lot of people, I think, who would report fried fish are eating fish and chips. That's probably the most common type of fried fish people are eating. And again, these results were regardless of lots of factors, including vitamin D. Because of that, it does indicate that fish is beneficial regardless of the vitamin D content in fish. So there's something else in fish that's protective, or it could be that people who eat fish may be following a healthier lifestyle in another way. something that we haven't been able to record or measure. Now, in the MS Sunshine study, they had a slightly different question. They had a question around fresh fish. But again, we saw that people who eat fresh fish at least once a week had a 30% reduced risk of SCD. And that was compared with people who ate it very seldom or never. So we saw really the same effect in this totally different population. Again, it didn't seem to have anything to do with vitamin D. So that leads me to wonder if it is the omega-3, which we know omega-3 is really important in the brain. It's important as part of the myelin sheath. So there's a plausible link there. Or it could be, as I mentioned, maybe these people are following a healthier diet or lifestyle in a way that we can't measure or that we didn't measure. So the third thing I looked at was meat intake. Now I'm sure you've heard many people talking about links between red meat and other diseases like bowel cancer, diabetes, heart disease. It should be remembered though that often, particularly a few years ago, people weren't separating processed and lean red meat when they did these studies. Now researchers have started to separate processed versus lean red meat, and a lot of the effects we see are actually relating specifically to processed meat. So bacon, ham, sausages, cured meat, salami. These things seem to have a very negative effect on our health generally. In terms of MS, there has been hardly any research at all around meat and MS, even though it is a topic of conversation among people with MS. The only study that I know of is what we call an ecological study. So researchers noted that in countries or areas where there's a lot of MS, there was also high processed meat intake in that population. But this is very, very low level evidence because obviously there might be lots of other factors in those areas not to do with processed meat. The reason I'm interested in non-processed meat is because in Australia, it's actually the biggest contributor to our omega-3 intakes. And one of the reasons is because we generally eat grass-fed beef, which is fairly high in omega-3. So it's nowhere near as high as oily fish, but as a population, we generally eat quite a lot of red meat compared with fish. A lot of people don't eat oily fish. So what we found was, interestingly, a 40% lower risk of SCD with higher lean red meat, so non-processed red meat consumption. Now, put it into some context. So if you think of an adult female who's consuming around 2,000 kilocalories a day, that equates to around 70 grams a day of lean red meat. And of course, it's not something you need to eat every day. It might be something you eat a few times a week in varying amounts. But the point is there's no additional beneficial effect of more than that. So this is not a high meat diet. It's a moderate meat intake diet. So when you go to the supermarket, you think you're going to buy a steak, whatever it is, it's around 100 grams of raw red meat, which you then cook, and that becomes 70 grams of your cooked meat. So if you think about a steak like a porterhouse steak or a sirloin steak, they might be 200 to 250 grams raw. So we're not saying to eat that every day. But you can see how, over the course of a week, you could consume this amount of meat, and it's not considered high. It's within the Australian dietary guidelines. So we found that there was no link between processed meat and SCD. So it wasn't harmful and it wasn't beneficial. But we do know that processed red meat is harmful for other conditions. So the fourth factor I looked at was antioxidant intake. There has been some limited research about antioxidants in MS because they could potentially help prevent cell and tissue damage in the brain as well. So antioxidants are things we get from fruit and veg, primarily. There are many, many, hundreds of antioxidants. Some of the main ones are vitamin C, vitamin E, and the carotenes. So some of the carotenes then become vitamin A in our bodies. These are the ones I looked at because these are what are available from the questionnaire. It's very difficult to measure many of the different antioxidants from a food questionnaire. But what I found with all of these was that there was no link whatsoever with FCD. So these things weren't harmful and they weren't beneficial. Now I will say though that we could only look at antioxidants from food. We know that many Australians take supplements and many of those supplements contain antioxidants and in much higher amounts that we would get normally in food, but we weren't able to look at intake from supplements. So that's one limitation to this study. Another limitation is that food frequency questionnaires, although they're good at capturing a usual intake of food over the year, they're not very good at identifying intakes of very specific nutrients. So that's a second limitation. But we would expect that if there was something going on, we would see at least a hint of it by doing this analysis, and we just didn't see anything. So in terms of what's next, obviously I mentioned that we have data from the MS Sunshine study, and I would like to repeat more of these analyses in the MS Sunshine study. Because I'm particularly interested in omega-3 based on the fish and meat results, the next step would be to actually measure omega-3 in people's blood. That's important because people might report what they eat in their diet, but it's very hard to actually work out how much of a nutrient like omega-3 they're getting unless you measure it directly in their blood. So that's like the next level of evidence. The other thing I'd like to look at is disease progression. So everything I've talked about so far has been about risk. So this information might not be relevant for people who already have MS. This information is important for people who are high risk of getting MS. So maybe they have a family member who has MS. So the factors that affect risk of MS might be different from disease progression. So there are two follow-up studies, the OS1 study and the MS Sunshine follow-up study, which are following the people who then progress to MS. And they're collecting dietary information as well. So sometime in the future, we can actually look at some of these dietary factors and disease progression. And ultimately, all of this research is really background evidence to support the necessity of a clinical trial. So before we can influence policy and practice and report recommendations for people with MS or at high risk of MS, we really need to have this level of evidence, something from a clinical trial. They're very expensive, they're very time consuming, they're burdensome for participants who might have to change their diet or take supplements. So you can't go from nothing to a clinical trial. You have to have a lot of background evidence to suggest that. So if we continue to see a benefit of omega-3, that could be something that we would consider then for a clinical trial. Now the honours project I wanted to talk about was being conducted this year by our honours student Rebecca, and she's interested in looking at what type of dietary changes people make after they're diagnosed with MS. So the idea is that we want to understand more about the changes people are making and why they might be making them, and what kind of information they want to know about diet, what kind of format they want the information in, and what they want us to help them to learn about diet. So Rebecca is or will be recruiting soon, and she's hoping to conduct interviews with people over the next month and July as well. So she'll be looking to talk to people for up to an hour, just one-to-one with Rebecca about their diet. And that will help us hopefully develop resources for people with MS. So I've put Rebecca's contact details there, and she is in the audience. She's just standing up there to say hello. So if anybody wants to talk to Rebecca, she'll be at the back afterwards. We've also got some great resources at the back as well, if anybody's interested in getting some more information about diet. And I just want to add again, which I know I put this up last time when I spoke here, and there's some copies of this at the back, but this is the best available evidence we have at the moment for people with MS and people at high risk of MS. Many people don't follow the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. And this is the best step you can make right now to help improve your health through diet. And when you look at the results that I've presented on risk of MS, they fall in these guidelines. So we certainly should be including oily fish in our diet. A couple of times a week would be ideal. And there's no harm in eating lean red meat as long as it's not excessive consumption. And the main thing as well to remember is to avoid that only sometimes and in small amounts category. That is unfortunately what a lot of people consume a lot of. So a really big thank you to MSWA for funding my fellowship, because it's really given me an opportunity to embark on this research field of diet and MS. And I'm excited about where it might go and how it might help people who have MS and who are at risk of MS. I have some wonderful collaborators over East who are all experts in MS, and also my collaborators in California. And I have a lovely team of nutritionists at Curtin. Thank you.